regular basis. But we have a great program, a great sessions to go forward, and none more important than the one we're about to start, which is asking the question of setting ambient air quality standards and what does science have to do with it. I will tell you up front that one of our wrinkles of trying to get everybody here is that one of the organizers of this meeting was Hannah Buchgard, who many of you know, and transportation didn't help her. Her flight was canceled. She's in the air currently. She's going to be here, and we're looking forward to seeing her later tonight. But right now, I'm going to hand you over to the two chairs we have for this session, and we're very pleased to have them here. First, Kiros Berhane. Dr. Berhane is the Cynthia and Robert Cisco Russlin and Leslie Goldstein Professor and Chair at Columbia University. He is a world-renowned biostatistician and a member of both the HEI Review Committee and the HEI Global Health Oversight Committee. Joining him is Barbara Hoffmann, who's a professor of environmental epidemiology at the Henrichs University of Düsseldorf in Germany, and very active in the European Respiratory Society as well, and a member of the HEI Research Committee, both having contributed dramatically to both the production and then the review of our science. And with that, I turn it to the two of them to take you into the session.
So thank you, Dan, for introducing us. And welcome to everybody here at the conference, and welcome to everybody online joining us. The session that we are just about to start is usually a session that is placed at the end of conferences because it kind of addresses the end product of our research, which is, making laws about the things that we learn in our research. But I think it's really good that this time we have it at the beginning of the conference, because the legislation that follows from our work that we're doing is also the motivation for the specific topics that we research on, and it's a motivation to look closer in specific issues that are important for policy making. And this is also, as we all know, one of the specific targets of what HEI is doing, providing relevant research that can be used for policy making. So I think we all agree that the driving force for our work here is that we want clean air for better health. Currently, air pollution is still the #4 killer worldwide, and that is certainly still a devastating situation. Yet about 1/3 of 170 countries that were screened a while ago for effective air pollution regulation, they have no policies in place. So this is a situation we cannot be content with. At the same time, we have ongoing crises that are aggravating the situation about air pollution and health. And I brought just one example because it concerns my home country. We all know with the war in the Ukraine that especially Germany is being kind of blackmailed with their gas resources that we depend on Russia. Now, Germany, as well as several other European countries, have decided to go back to coal burning after we have passed laws about phasing out and getting rid of coal. And specifically in Germany, in my country, right close to where I live, we are going back to heavy-duty lignite, open pit mining, and burning of lignite. And these coal-burning power plants are the worst in Europe in terms of air pollution production. So this is really a situation we cannot be happy about, and we need to make significant changes. So what role can society play in policy making? And today in this session, we will focus on two examples, one from the US and one from Europe, about the strategies, the approaches that these two regions are taking in terms of air quality control. We will start out with a short introduction by Dan Greenbaum, president of HEI, and he will give a kind of a bird's eye overview of the two different systems and approaches towards air quality regulation, and point us specifically to the similarities and the differences between these two approaches. Afterwards, Dorota Jarosinska from WHO Regional Office in Europe will present the process of evidence synthesis that was applied for derivation of the new ambient air quality guidelines that were published last September. And after this, we will take a really closer look into the processes taken in the US EPA done by Erika Sasser from EPA and by Thomas Henrichs from the European Commission, where we will learn about the ongoing process of revising the Ambient Air Quality Directive in Europe. Finally, last but not least, Christina Fuller from CASAC will talk about the importance of taking minority groups, most specifically vulnerable people, into account, and what needs to be done to design air quality regulation in a way that everybody can benefit from it. So without much further ado, I would like to invite Dan Greenbaum to come up to the podium and give us a short introduction into the two different systems of ambient air quality regulation.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and hello again. This isn't the first time that HEI has actually asked this question about how does the EU do this? How does the US do it? What can we learn from each side? We've got a great panel today and to take us through that. And I'm going to talk in general terms about how these two processes work, how they're similar and how they're different. Setting ambient air quality standards is a key first step in achieving clean air. If you don't have a standard, if you don't know where you need to get to, how do you measure what progress you're making or what actions you need to take? And what we'll see is there are many similarities. It's not surprising in the EU and the US processes, but there are also some important differences. First, the basic approaches are very similar. We assess the science, we analyze policy options, we propose standards or limit values, and there's a public review and a decision process. And at each stage, there are some differences. In the US, the Office of Research and Development of EPA produces an integrated science assessment, which is reviewed by the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, a peer review committee established in the Clean Air Act. And there's opportunities during that for extensive public comment on the integrated science assessment as well. In the EU, the Commission relies on the World Health Organization and its guidelines development group, who develop both the underlying science and then the World Air Quality Guidelines in order to synthesize what we know about the science. That process has somewhat more limited public comment than the EPA process. The policy assessment process has its own wrinkles in each side, and we'll hear a lot from Erika and Thomas about those. But basically, in the US, EPA's Office of Air and Radiation puts together a policy assessment. That too is reviewed by CASAC, and there are opportunities for public comment. And the DG Environment does something similar, a scenario analysis. And that too, there is extensive stakeholder discussions of that and what's going into that. The proposal of the standards and limit values is a little different in the sense that the Commission does put together, based on its review, its analysis, a proposal which it's making to the European Parliament and the European Council, which I'll explain in a moment. Whereas in EPA, the EPA Office of Air and Radiation puts together its proposal, which it is making to the EPA administrator, who then issues that for public comment. And I will say that on both sides of the Atlantic, the teams working on this must subject their analyses and activities to a very rigorous review inside the government before it comes out publicly. Reviewing the cost and benefit analysis, reviewing the assumptions that are made in it. And that gauntlet, it can be a real challenge. And I bet they're different, but there are probably a lot of similarities on either side of the Atlantic. And finally, after public hearings, the EPA administrator, confident that the staff have produced responses to the comments, issues a final decision. It's quite different in Europe, where what is proposed by the Commission must then be agreed to in a process called co-decision, where the European Parliament and the European Council, which is the prime ministers of all of the member states, must agree on the action. So many similarities, different ways of doing it, but assessing the most current science and exposure and health. And I do know that WHO, for example, uses the EPA integrated science assessments in its own work at that. So there's some overlap in that. The policy and risk analyses, each has their own way of doing it, but there are lots of similarities. And there is public communication and input from diverse stakeholders throughout the policy analysis process. There are some differences. The more public review of the science in the US EPA PASAC process versus the less public WHO review. That review is conducted by the Guidelines Development Group, not in open meetings. But some would argue, and I've certainly seen this, that the result is WHO has the opportunity to have a more independent look at the science than the more public review that occurs in the US. The consideration of cost is different. Both organizations produce estimates of costs and benefits, but the US Clean Air Act actually does not allow consideration of cost in the setting of standards. And then an important difference that I was alluding to is who makes the decision. In the US, it's the EPA administrator following public review procedures and something called the Administrative Procedures Act. And in Europe, while the Commission proposes, the Parliament and a qualified majority of the European Council must agree on the action. And for those of you from the US, to put that in our local context, that would mean that every time EPA proposed a new ambient air quality standard, that the Congress and a majority of the state governors in the United States would have to approve it. It's really a statement, a testament really to the capabilities of the EU, that it has standards, it's made it through this process, and it's been implementing those standards, and kudos to them for that. There are some other differences. Oops, sorry. Both systems use region-wide control measures for implementation, things like vehicle emission standards that go across Europe or across the United States. There are differences in enforcement approaches for ensuring that states and member states actually take action. Both the US EPA and the EU have methods for doing that, for enforcing that, but they are different. I won't go into every detail of that here. An important difference is the timeline for reviews. The US Clean Air Act requires review of the science and the standards every 5 years. There's no similar requirement in the EU Air Quality Directive. Having said that, the US process has really met exactly 5 years, but it has meant that when they miss it, lawsuits can be filed, schedules can be dictated, and the result is that the newest science has been considered more frequently. I just want to say, as we talk about and hear about the differences and the similarities, et cetera, it's important to remember that in the end, both of these processes in both the EU and the US have resulted in the setting of standards and the implementation of standards And in each case, both Europe and the US has been seeing improvements in air quality, cleaner air, and better health. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
I get this to work? Is this working? Yeah, it seems like great. But thanks, Dan, for this great and concise overview of the two different systems. And the next speaker will be Dorota Jarosinska from the WHO Regional Office in Europe, which is located in Bonn in Germany. Dorota will join us online. Dorota, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
I
great.
hope you can also hear me and
Yeah.
see the slides. Please
So-
kindly confirm.
Let me just quickly introduce you while you're already here. Let's see. Dorota is a specialist in public health, working for nearly 30 years on health and environmental issues at the WHO European Center for Environment and Health in Bonn. She manages a program on living and working environments, which covers a diverse portfolio, including air quality and health, health aspects of climate change mitigation, chemical safety, environmentally sustainable health systems, environmental noise, and occupational health. Recently, she was coordinating the project on the development of the new WHO Ambient Air Quality, Global Air Quality Guidelines. So, Dorota, we're all happy that you're with us, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Good day to everyone. Even though it's only through this small Zoom screen, I'm very happy to be part of this session and to present the work on developing the WHO air quality guidelines, not representing a regulator, and the guidelines, which are not a piece of regulation. These are not legally binding standards and norms, but the guidelines, which are a very solid and robust reference for developing policies, for developing setting standards. I believe that most of the conference participants is aware that WHO has been producing the guidelines since 1980s. And indeed, last September, we published the new global air quality guidelines. They are aiming at giving the levels of air quality for selected air pollutants, which will be protective for the population health. As mentioned, they are to support informed decision-making at different levels. They are meant for the worldwide use, and they are based on a very comprehensive assessment of the evidence. So this new edition of Global Air Quality Guidelines formulates air quality guideline levels for selected air pollutants, PM2.5, PM10, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide, and a complete novelty, a qualitative so-called good practice statements. They are meant to be robust evidence-informed reference to be used by decision makers, but also other users to effectively develop effective measures that would contribute to improving air quality and through this protecting human health. It's very likely that by now many of you are familiar with the guidelines, meaning with the values, but let me remind that the new air quality guideline levels are set for PM2.5, PM10, ozone, NO2, SO2, and carbon monoxide. And these new air quality levels are marked here in green. In addition to these ultimate ambition levels to protect human health, the document contains also interim targets, a feature that was present already in the edition from 2006, and the previous air quality guideline values became new interim targets. Those are marked in red on the table. It is therefore apparent that the air quality guideline levels for PM2.5, PM10, and for NO2 decreased as compared to the previous edition. Interim targets is not a new feature, but a very important feature, also from the perspective of its use by member states. Because air quality guideline levels now, but also in the past, they were quite ambitious, especially in some parts of the world where air pollution levels are high. And this gap between the reality and the ultimate ambition to get good air quality might be even discouraging for action. Hence, these interim targets to guide these continuous improvements of air quality, always keeping in mind that we aim to achieve air quality guideline levels. And then this new feature of good practice statements, focusing on managing certain types of particulate matter. These are sand and dust storms, black and elemental carbon, and ultrafine particles. These types of PM were very extensively discussed by the guideline development group, and we were following scientific developments in the period of developing the guidelines. And the conclusion was that there is not enough evidence to follow the process of developing guideline levels. However, recognizing health concerns and evaluating the available evidence and information, some qualitative statements were made related to the needs and advances in monitoring, mitigation measures that can already now be undertaken, and further research needs. So this is a completely new feature for the first time appearing in the WHO air quality guidelines. So this is a summary of what the guidelines contain in terms of recommendations and statements. As the subject of this session is how the evidence has been built and how this can be taken up in the regulation, just a quick reminder how the WHO guidelines are being developed. So the first stages, this is a scoping of the guidelines. It is the identification of the key groups involved in this process, and the central group is GDG, so Guideline Development Group, but also there is external review group composed of individual experts and stakeholders. There is also a WHO steering group. And GDG is discussing and making decision on selecting the health outcomes to be considered and formulating questions for which the evidence will be reviewed. The first proposal of the guideline is being prepared and undergoes an internal WHO approval process by the Guideline Review Committee. The next step is the process of retrieving and synthesizing the evidence structured alongside these questions. And this task is undertaken by yet another group, a systematic review team, in fact, a group of teams working on these individual topics. The systematic reviews, meta-analysis, and the completion of this stage is the assessment of the certainty of the body of evidence that has been reviewed, in this sense that it's a confidence that the estimates generated really reflect the actual effects and that they can be the basis of formulating recommendations. In the case of air quality guidelines, formulating air quality guideline levels. And this process was followed when developing air quality guidelines However, there were needs for some methodological developments when it comes to the stage of assessing the certainty of the body of evidence. As in this assessment framework, study design that is ranked as of high quality is randomized study designs that follows the generic hierarchy of the quality of the evidence and works well for the guidelines or for recommendations in the area of clinical medicine. However, this was a huge challenge when evaluating the body of evidence composed mainly of observational studies, and giving them low quality evidence at the onset would then have implications for the strengths of the recommendations formulated, meaning for air quality guidelines. Therefore, through a very intensive process, the group concluded and decided to develop an adaptation of this assessment of the quality of the evidence framework. It's not a generic adaptation of GREAT framework for environment and health, but it was developed specifically to support the assessment of the certainty of the evidence for the systematic reviews that were commissioned for the update of the guidelines. The ratings and this approach was used both by the systematic review teams and then in the process of deriving air quality guideline levels. And this indeed was a quite demanding developmental process. The main features of this adaptation of this assessment framework, the most important point was to start the rating of the certainty of the evidence for observational studies, not as low quality, but as moderate quality. And then the assessments in several domains, they were considered independent on each other, and some additional guidance was provided. And this adaptation of this GREAT framework is published together with the systematic reviews of the evidence, which all are part of the special issue of Environment International. Let me just very briefly mention that another methodological work has been done by the experts involved in the development of the guidelines. That is a dedicated tool to assess the risk of bias for the systematic reviews conducted to inform the work on the guidelines. And this is also published on the website of WHO. So these elements, these methodological considerations and work done by the guideline development group, these are transparently presented and are available. Having the systematic reviews completed, the guideline development group agreed also and developed a procedure from moving from the evidence to air quality guideline levels. I will not go into details, but all these steps, they are described in a generic sense in the guidelines document, and they are also described for each and every air quality guideline level set and included in the document. So now, having an overview of the main steps in developing the guidelines and how the evidence was evaluated and transformed in the guideline levels, and looking more ahead towards its application, the guidelines, of course, can be used in a variety of manners. What's most important in the context of today's discussion is this evidence-informed tool to support policies and legislation, but also to stimulate research, as the document itself identifies also a number of knowledge gaps and directions of possible future research. And not to be forgotten also in the context of bigger environmental change and challenges to public health is the link with the climate agenda. So as Barbara has said, the guidelines were launched in September 21. The document as such and the launch attracted a lot of media attention. But what is important also in the mid and longer term, it also has been reflected in a number of medical journals. By now, the guidelines have been cited more than 200 times, systematic reviews also quite extensively. And air quality guidelines last year were considered as one of the top key global health moments of activities of the World Health Organization. There is sustained interest in the guidelines, and we see downloads from the website exceeding 90,000, and the actual uptake in policy processes, either in the individual member states or at supranational level, like in the EU, and we will hear more about it. The document contains, the guideline documents contains, of course, recommendations, good practice statements, but also contains some considerations related to implementation of the guidelines, basic conditions that need to be met, and the key enabling factors. We have already heard in the opening words by Dan about the need for institutional and human capacities, the crucial role of the existence of standards and systems of air quality monitoring, the whole system of air quality management, the relevance of public access to air quality data, but also capacities to conduct health risk assessment so that priorities for action really serve protection of the population. And last but not least, the relevance of cooperation. So this is kind of a checklist to be considered by member states to identify and to see what is the situation, what are the main needs and capacities. The guidelines, air quality guideline levels, good practice statements, interim targets, as well as information available in the systematic reviews. It's can be of relevance and use for different groups of users, authorities, but also technical experts, those who take care of health and environmental impact assessments, but also in the domain of researchers and academia, and last but not least, civil society advocacy groups that can use this as a strong argument to advocate for the effective measures to improve air quality.
Dorota, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, so this update, the update of air quality guidelines to develop or update legally binding air quality standards, but also to enhance multi-sectorial cooperation and to use also air quality guidelines as a tool to give more emphasis on the equity dimension and to contribute to reducing health inequities. We will hear more about setting air quality standards. Just to add that using air quality guidelines as a reference point, it is clear that member states or other entities may need to consider a number of other factors when setting the standards, in addition to the scientific evidence underpinning air quality guideline levels. Barbara has already mentioned the insufficiency of the existence of national standards. This is an overview published in the guidelines coming from 2017, showing that in some parts of the world, these standards are not yet in place. And last year, UNEP published a very comprehensive assessment, again showing very clearly that a lot is still to be done to develop or to get up to speed or up to quality, air quality standards in different member states. And finally, I would like to stress the role of the health sector in this, because many interventions and actions to improve air quality are beyond the remits of the health sector. However, we still need to remember that health sector has a crucial role to raise awareness, advise both the public and patients, to play a role in gathering evidence, and to be a strong advocate. WHO actively supports the efforts to facilitate implementation of the guidelines, and these are some communication efforts, including ensuring translations of the executive summaries, organization of communication materials, but also initiating science and policy dialogues in member states, continuing building capacities, and also continuing the work on methodological developments, building on the evidence reviewed for the guidelines. And finally, I have a pleasure of presenting the work on the guidelines as a person coordinating this work from the WHO side. But this is, of course, a tremendous effort and gratefully acknowledged effort of experts and stakeholders in all those groups. And also, we acknowledge the support received throughout this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorota, for giving us this overview of this absolutely great piece of work. Because we're already a little bit short on time, we will have a joint discussion of all presentations at the end of the session. So at this moment, I'd therefore like to invite to the podium Erika Sasser from the US EPA. She's the director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division within the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards at the US EPA. She directs programs to assess exposures and risks from criteria and toxic air pollution, and to evaluate the costs, benefits, and economic impacts of EPA air quality regulations. And she will now tell us specifically about the process that Dan already introduced, how air quality regulation is being organized in the US. Erika,
green is forward. Yes, okay, thank you. Get acclimated here. It's really good to be here. It's great to see everyone. My first professional conference back since the pandemic, and it's wonderful to see so many faces in person. I want to say from the outset today that I am joined by a number of my colleagues in the audience, many of whom are more expert at parts of the process I'm going to talk about than I am. So we may call on them at some point for questions about some of the things I'm going to discuss. And I want to start by reiterating some things that Dan touched on at the beginning. I do think the United States program has many strengths. I'm going to talk about those a little bit. And we have some unique features based on the design of the Clean Air Act and the requirements for the program. We spend an inordinate amount of time, in my view, visiting and revisiting the science. But I believe that scrutiny is incredibly important in formulating good public policy and good public health decisions. So I'm going to touch on these topics today, and I'm going to come back at the end to the question of how the standards are implemented, because I do believe that is one of the great strengths of the United States program, is not only the standard setting process, but the way in which those standards then are enforced and become very binding for the parties that must meet them. So as I said already, the Clean Air Act, which is our governing law, is a very cleverly constructed law, very rigorous. I continue to be amazed. I've been at the EPA 18 years now, and I am still amazed at the way in which the statute was forward thinking about the types of problems that would emerge in the United States. And so the standards in the United States are based on very extensive scientific review, which I will talk about. But the Act also provides mechanisms to deal with some of the common problems in managing air quality, such as interstate transport, international transport, things we call exceptional events, which are things like wildfires. So the implementation regime, again, is a good complement to the program. And we do review the standards every 5 years, but we also have rigorous timelines for areas to meet the standards. And that depends in part on the severity of the pollution that they are experiencing. So as I said, I'm going to come back to some of these implementation concerns at the end. And there you can see in the map, the EPA regions. The country is divided into 10 regions. They each have their own EPA office in addition to the EPA headquarters. So let me start with a little bit of information about the actual standard setting requirements in the Clean Air Act. We have only 6 pollutants in this program. We have another 188 pollutants that we regulate under our air toxics program. The requirements for that program are essentially source-based, right? They're based on industry standards. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards program is based on ambient concentrations of pollutants. And these were pollutants that Congress recognized were ubiquitous. So the number of sources contributing and the number of locations that were affected made these 6 pollutants stand apart. The Clean Air Act says we should set both primary or health-based and secondary or welfare-based standards. It sets out somewhat different requirements for each of those types of standards. So the primary standards are standards that are in the judgment of the administrator, must be requisite to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. And as the slide notes, requisite means sufficient, but not more than necessary. So the goal of the EPA program is not to eliminate risk, but to determine what is an acceptable level of risk for public health, taking into account the requirement for an adequate margin of safety. And in thinking about margin of safety, we think about the nature of the health effects, the size of the population at risk, and also the degree of uncertainty that may be present in the evidence with regard to whether such effects will in fact occur. And I want to note that this term requisite is very important in our program because inevitably, when we issue a standard, we are sued from both directions in the American court. So we get lawsuits suggesting that our standards are not stringent enough, and we get lawsuits saying that they are too stringent. So the administrator's task is really to find the spot that's supported by the evidence that provides the margin of safety, but is not more stringent than can be justified based on current scientific uncertainty. It's quite a burden, and the administrator spends an inordinate amount of time on this decision. We spend a lot of hours going through a lot of complex scientific and risk assessment information with the administrator, in all my experience. Secondary standards for ecological or welfare-based effects, as you can see there, there's quite a range of effects that are designed to be controlled by the secondary standards, including climate. I mean, again, Clean Air Act, this was written in 1970, but they were looking ahead, and that has been important as the program has developed. So things like visibility, damage to wildlife, damage to soils, things like that. And as Dan already mentioned, we are barred from considering cost, and this has gone all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and we really partition the discussion of cost. We save that for the implementation phase. So when we're setting the standards, there's no discussion about how much this a standard might cost the United States. Okay, this is just a summary table of our current standards, and there are 4 aspects to every standard. There is the indicator, or the pollutant that's measured, the averaging time, the level, and the form. And many times we get distracted by the level, but these other elements are also very important because they together define the statistic that the monitor has to meet to determine whether an area is in attainment or not. And I've highlighted in yellow the reviews that we have ongoing right now. So as you see, they're not all lit up, but most of them are underway, and we are, in fact, very busy. Okay, so the process. This is a schematic that's just designed to give you the high-level overview. I'm going to walk through the steps in a little more detail, but what I want to point out here is that there are three main phases. There is a planning phase, which is fairly short, and we're usually just looking at what was done in the last review, thinking about what it might be new or if there are new elements we want to incorporate, and designing a plan. Pretty quickly, we move into the assessment phase, and that is really the bulk of the time. In the 5-year period, we probably spend about 4 years on the assessment phase. And I think the complexity of what I'm going to talk about next will demonstrate why we spend so much time there. We do 3 things in the assessment phase. We issue an integrated science assessment. We issue risk and exposure analyses, sometimes as a separate document, but often integrated with the third item you see there, which is the policy assessment. And the policy assessment is really where we boil it all down to say, what does this mean? What conclusions can be drawn from the current evidence? And then from there, those phases in green all go through public comment, and they also go through review by the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. So throughout the first several years of the review, we are getting extensive public and peer review of each product. Then we move into the blue box, which is the rulemaking phase. That is a very formal phase defined by the Administrative Procedures Act and other elements of the American system. I'll come back to that. Okay, so let's talk about that first document, the Integrated Science Assessment. This is really where we are attempting to gather and synthesize all available scientific information that's pertinent to a given review. So I'm going to use particulate matter as an example because we are in the middle of a reconsideration of the particulate matter standards. When we do a literature search for particulate matter, we come down with thousands and thousands of references, and those have to be reviewed, evaluated, and integrated into a story or a comprehensive evaluation. So the goals of the integrated science assessment are to characterize the strengths and the uncertainties in the evidence, to draw from that evidence conclusions on causality for both health and welfare effects, to characterize potential risks for the population as a whole, but also for those at-risk groups that I mentioned. So we will have a chapter that looks specifically at, and it varies by pollutant, populations that may be at higher risk for exposure to that pollutant. And then, of course, we're also looking at what type of dose response information we have in that we can extract from the studies. So there's, as you can see in the diagram, the words are probably pretty small, but you have the slides. This is a really extensive process, very carefully organized, designed to be systematic and to produce causal determinations, which are really synthesizing and integrating all the information that we have. And again, as you can see in the green boxes there, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee is advising us and the public is commenting throughout this phase. I mentioned the causality determinations. These are in some ways the foundation for the review because this is the sort of highest level conclusion about the strength of the evidence for a given endpoint. And it draws on a host of studies from a host of different disciplines. And the goal is to evaluate those individual studies, characterize their results, and then integrate all that evidence across the disciplines in an organized way. So there's an established framework that we've used, and we can talk more about that later if there are questions on that. We have a framework that's been developed and applied over well more than a decade now. I think the current version we're using. And part of that is looking at populations that have higher risk from these exposures. I'm going to go on to the next one because this is also still about the causality determinations. The advantages of the framework that we use, we feel, are that they the framework provides transparency. So there's a very clear accounting of how the different disciplines are integrated and how they are interpreted, how the sum of the information is interpreted. It is applied systematically, so we use the same framework in every review. And again, we are focused on synthesizing. And we have different, I mean, that previous slide, which I can go back to, I guess, different reviews have definitely different strengths. Different boxes will have more or fewer studies for a given review. And the strength of the evidence in a given category becomes very crucial for how we set policy. Okay, so at the end of it, then we have causal determinations in 5 categories: causal, likely causal, suggestive, inadequate, or not likely to be a causal relationship. And they're all important because they all inform whether standards are needed, whether standards need to be revised, and if we're going to consider revising, which pieces of evidence are most critical. So this is an example from the latest integrated science assessment for particulate matter. This was completed in 2019. And here you can see the array of types of health effects on the left-hand side and the conclusions that were reached in the ISA for the different categories of endpoints. And I will note that, one of the reasons particulate matter is so important in our system is because the causal determinations for cardiovascular and mortality effects become very powerful drivers of the policy discussion around this. So these things that are suggestive are important and they are considered, but they're less likely to drive a decision than things that are in causal or likely causal categories. I will note that the National Academies is currently underway with a major review of our causal framework. So we expect some advice from them fairly soon. I don't believe a date has been set for that yet, but we look forward very much to hearing what the National Academies have to say and to advise us with regard to further development of this framework, which, as I said, has been pretty systematically applied now for some time. Okay, so at the end of the day, we have an integrated science assessment, very comprehensive, boils it down to causal conclusions, also describes uncertainties and research needs. And we take that and we move into the risk and exposure phase, where we think about which endpoints is there sufficient information for us to develop a quantitative assessment. And again, we're going to focus on those causal or likely causal endpoints. We want to use the strongest information we have because those are the things that are most compelling for the administrator when he's making a decision. Different pollutants are handled differently in the quantitative phase. We tend to try to really think about, again, what is the nature of effects, how easily can we measure it and trace the, from atmospheric concentration to exposure to health outcome, or in some cases, like with lead, through an additional exposure pathway such as ingestion, and separate that out from inhalation and try to piece apart what does it mean to have an ambient air quality standard for a pollutant like lead, for which we also set toxic standards, actually. So these assessments can be very complicated, often takes a year or more to develop. And the goal of this is to provide some quantitative information for the administrator to consider in thinking about the magnitude of the public health risk, right? Who's affected, how many people, how severely, can we put numbers around those impacts? At-risk populations, very important throughout the review. With the most recent PM2.5 quantitative assessment, we did look specifically at at-risk populations. It was one of the first times that we had concentration response functions that were differentiated by race and ethnicity, which became a really important factor in our ability to actually characterize risk for different segments of the population. So we feel like we're pushing the envelope, we're trying to develop this part of our program, and we're really happy to see the epi literature starting to report these kinds of functions.
Erika, you have a look at the time.
Okay. This is a diagram that I think Dr. Fuller is going to come back to this discussion about at risk, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, other than to note that what we see here is that as we consider tighter standards, as we consider moving from the current standard to tighter standards, we do see a reduction in the degree of disparity in health risk across different groups in the US population. A very important finding. Okay, the policy assessment is then the point at which we're drawing all of this together, and we're considering whether or not the standard should be revised, and if so, what types of revisions might be appropriate. So we're putting together conclusions for the administrator to consider, and again, it goes through CASAC. Okay, so then after the policy assessment is done, the administrator makes decisions and we enter the formal regulatory phase, issues a proposed decision, it goes through interagency review, so other federal agencies have a chance to review it, and then we go through public comment and ultimately issue a final decision. Very, very typical regulatory process for us. Okay, as I said, I do want to come back at the end here to talk a little bit about, we've gone through all this process, we've set a standard that we think is based on the greatest and latest science, but what happens next? And then what happens next is really important in the US system, because what happens next is the Clean Air Act specifies a whole host of obligations on states and local areas to meet these standards. And the regime is very rigorously enforced, which means that once we set a new standard, we are confident that there will be significant investments in emissions reductions to achieve the standard. So these are just some details about the implementation phase. We designate areas as non-attainment if they're not meeting the standard. They have to develop a plan. They have to specify the measures that they're going to adopt to improve air quality. And ultimately, EPA must approve that plan. And oftentimes we send it back to the states, ask them to do more homework. And they can't get out of the non-attainment designation until they submit clean data, usually 3 years of clean data. So they really have to demonstrate progress in order to get an attainment designation. And just last but not least, I couldn't resist throwing in our trend slide. This is the progress in the US program since 1990. And as you can see, all the pollutants have been coming down at various rates, and we've been making significant progress.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Erika, so much for this great overview of the process here in the United States. I think we have time for 1 or 2 clarification questions, if necessary. If not, then we will move on to the next speaker, and I'll pass on to my co-chair to introduce the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Barbara, for so ably chairing the session so far. And I would also like to add my welcome to everyone for attending this session, and also to the previous speakers. So far we have heard about, the overall setup, and also the WHO and US practices. And now I'll have the 2 last speakers introduced. The first one is Thomas Henrichs, who is going to tell us about the EU process. Thomas, can you hear us?
Good afternoon. I can hear you quite loud and clear. I hope you can hear me.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So let me introduce Thomas, and then I'll introduce the talk as well. Thomas Henrichs is Deputy Head of Unit for Clean Air and Urban Policy within DG Environment at the European Commission. His work focuses on all aspects of EU clean air policy and on the Ambient Air Quality Directives in particular. He's going to tell us today about current efforts underway to revise ambient air quality standards, EU Ambient Air Quality Directives guided by the Zero Pollution Action Plan and European Green Deal. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I'm very sorry to not be with you in person and instead be staring at a screen in a room that I did not expect to be in, because I've also been hit by a couple of flight cancellation. But I hope this works well. And I'm going to be changing the slides myself. If you don't see the slides moving, please let me know. So what I would like to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes is to introduce you to the current efforts that are underway to revise the ambient air quality standards in Europe, most notably in the Ambient Air Quality Directive of the EU. This is guided by something we call what has been labeled the Zero Pollution Action Plan under the European Green Deal. And I'll start off with the first of 4 parts of my presentation to introduce to you what EU clean air policy looks like. Then I'll highlight a couple of shortcomings of our policy at the moment. I'll introduce some of the policy options we are analyzing, and I'll finish with a timeline. But I'll start off with this slide that most people working with air policy in Europe will have seen at some stage or another, but maybe not all of you in the room are familiar with, which is the structure of EU clean air policy. So we don't have one Clean Air Act, we have a 3-pillar approach to clean air policy, one pillar of which is the Ambient Air Quality Directive. It's a plural because there are 2 directives. Those are 2 bits of regulations that in total address 12 air pollutants, and they structure the way we measure air pollution and air quality and the kind of standards we strive to attain and what we do if we do not meet those standards at all the stations where they are supposed to be met. This is complemented by 2 other pieces of legislative strands. The first one is something we call the National Emission Reduction Commitment Directive, which sets targets for each of the 27 EU member states to reduce 5 pollutants at a national level by a certain amount by the year 2030 at the latest. And all of this is flanked by a host of source-specific emission standards, be it for industrial emissions, meaning combustion plants, energy generation, etc., eco-design directives, energy efficient directives, or the Euro fuel standards for cars. The idea being that we try to regulate those pollutant sources that contribute particularly to air pollution at source rather than just at the effect level. So if all of this works, we reduce emissions at source, we limit the emissions by at national level, and all of that should then lead to that we meet air quality standards everywhere. And this framework has rendered some successes. So if we look at the number of EU population that is exposed to air pollution above the standards we set ourselves, we see that for all pollutants, in this case, ozone, particulate matter, and nitrogen dioxide, we've seen a very clear downward trend of people being exposed. This, however, comes with a but, because we still do have quite a number of people exposed to levels above the standards we've set. And if we put the benchmark to the WHO guideline levels that Dorota has referred to, that number grows tremendously. And almost 4 out of 5 people across Europe are exposed to every single one of these pollutants, and in some cases, nearly everyone. Based on this, the Commission has then set forward a goal to learn from what is going well and not going well in the air quality legislation as it stands, to strengthen our provisions on monitoring, modeling, and air quality plans, meaning the actions we take when the air quality is not good, but also to revise the air quality standards themselves and to align them more closely with the WHO recommendations. And that's what we're doing now. But it may be good to, similarly like Erika did, to explain a little bit how we integrate ourselves in the policy process. And we have a policy cycle wheel here that summarizes policymaking from application to preparation to adoption to implementation, then reverting to application. Looks abstract. I'm going to walk you through this in just a second. In our case, we started off with looking at the policy as it stands and did a fitness check, an evaluation. We could do that because we've been monitoring the implementation of air quality policy over the last 2 and more decades. And based on this, we started with a roadmap of what we need to change. We consulted stakeholders what we are expected to change. We are doing an impact assessment that will result in a reflection on a legislative proposal that we then will see adopted by the College of Commissioners, that's by the Commission. The Commission only does the proposal. The legislative part of it then goes into a cycle where the European Parliament and the Council both have a view and a position on how to move forward. They negotiate as co-legislators and they agree on the final text, and that then becomes the European directive. It doesn't end there because this has to be transposed by the 27 member states. It has to be checked whether the transposition is correct, and then it has to be implemented. And that is the critical phase to actually achieve these new standards whenever they will come out. And that, of course, will then trigger a new cycle where we will look into whether these standards are met, where they are not met, to take action by the Commission, either by additional funding or by enforcement action, but also to reflect on why they may be met or not be met in some cases, and ultimately will result in a new cycle starting with an evaluation and a fitness check, and around it goes. Stakeholder input is available throughout this policy process and is a key element in this process. Now, with our most recent fitness check evaluation, we came up realizing that there are 5 key shortcomings. The first one is that we still see a health outcome shortcoming. So we've seen the mortality decrease, we've seen the exposure decrease, we've seen the mobility decrease over the last 2 decades, but we do at the same time realize that we are not aligned with scientific recommendations and the standards as we see them now. We were not before the WHO updated its standards, and we're certainly not now. So there's a certain shortcoming there in the level of our ambition. The second shortcoming is that while we've seen that the frequency, the extent, and the magnitude of exceedances above the standards that we have declined continuously over the last 2 decades, we still have those exceedances. And that in itself shows there is something not working in the implementation side of things. We have in total 29 cases where we have taken member states to the Court of Justice of the EU. This is a feature within the EU system, that when a member state does not live up to the expectations of EU law, the Commission, as a guardian of the treaty, takes member states to court. And in all cases that we've seen so far, the court has confirmed the position that the member states in question have not been doing sufficiently enough to keep exceedances as short as possible. But certainly there's a shortcoming here in the way that the legislation works. A third shortcoming is a governance shortcoming, and that is linked to the previous one that I mentioned, that we see these exceedances still, and part of that is that pollutants cannot always be managed at the scale at which they're experienced primarily. We all know that air pollution is a complex buildup of emissions that happen at transboundary level, at country level, at the wider city level, or at street level, and it comes from different sectors, from the transport sector, industrial sector, agricultural sector, and residential sector, meaning addressing air pollution requires all of these scales and all of these sectors to work together, and I think we might be able to do better here. The fourth shortcoming we see is a rather surprising one to us, because we do know that we have a lot of air quality information available. We feel this is one of the best informed environmental policy areas there is, with 4,000 monitoring stations across Europe. However, 54% of the European population doesn't feel sufficiently informed about air quality problems. So certainly there's something we need to do here. And the fifth shortcoming is that, and I mentioned this, we have 4,000 monitoring stations, but there are instances where we might be able to improve the comparability of air quality data even further when we look across different locations at which they've been placed, by being even clearer about where and how we measure air quality. Now this brings me to what we do next. And these 5 shortcomings have translated for us into 3 main policy options, 3 things we need to change. And this builds back into the mandate that we have been given by the Green Deal. The first, to closer align the air quality standards. The second, to improve the legislative framework, especially including as regards penalties for enforcement and governance, but also for public information. And third, to strengthen air quality monitoring, modeling, and plans. And the way we do this is that we have designed a total of 68 independent possible interventions that we could do to improve the current legislative framework. And we are impact assessing whether these would indeed render an improvement. And probably the most seminal example for doing so is the level of ambition, and I'll take PM2.5 as the example. We've seen from Dorota that there are guideline levels set at 5 micrograms for PM2.5 when we look at annual concentrations. There's also interim targets at 10, 15, 25, and 35. And the WHO is also quite clear about that with a heightened level of air pollution, we also accept a heightened level of mortality. That depends, of course, on the level that the standard is set and reached. Setting a standard on its own, of course, does not improve the air quality. It's actually meeting those standards that does this. So we are assessing in our impact assessment whether or not we are able to reach these different levels, which we call a high ambition, a mid ambition, and a low ambition scenario. Note that our current levels Our CARD standard is 25, which is a bit higher than the current US standard, obviously. And we then assess not only whether it's feasible, but also what the costs of attaining this level would be. We do this for PM2.5, but of course also for the other pollutants that are recommended by the WHO. And I've included this in the slide set so you can see the comparison between the levels recommended and the current EU standard. I will not go into any detail about the pollutants themselves. What I do want to show is this graph, which is a very dense and very full graph, but it actually shows you the monitored value of every single of the 4,000 monitoring stations across Europe for PM2.5. And what you see here for each member state, so for each country, you see a box plot with the lowest and the highest level shown for the member state. And you see a point in the middle where the two blue parts of the boxes meet, which is the median station. And you can see that if you map this against the guideline level or the interim target 4, 3, or 2 proposed by the WHO, that the gap to achieve the guideline level or the interim target 4 or 3 is going to be perceived as very different depending on where in Europe you are at the moment. So not a single member state has no exceedances above the guideline level, and quite a few have at least one station that is below the guideline level, but the majority doesn't at this stage have a station that is below 5 micrograms. So this is something, of course, we need to factor into our reflections on the feasibility of achieving a future air quality standard. We've also asked stakeholders about what they would want us to be setting, the level they would like us to set the standards at. This is an open public consultation. We've also done more targeted consultation, but what you see here is the result from the open public consultation with 931 replies. And you can see that on balance, NGOs that responded were very clearly of the view we should have a full alignment with the WHO. Citizens were a little bit less than the NGO, but still convinced that this was necessary at 79% of the respondents saying so. But when you look at industry and public authorities, there was a greater degree of skepticism about being either able to do so or whether it was desirable to see an air quality standard that is as stringent as the WHO guideline recommend to be set, in both cases being 36 or 38% of the respondents agreeing with this. It's interesting that in the industry segment, a quarter of the respondent, or slightly more than that, said the current standards as they are would be sufficient. We look at the different levels, so the medium, the high, and the low level standard setting, not only in a 2030 perspective, but also in a 2050 perspective. And we run, as I said before, a similar reflection for each of the pollutants we look at, and we look at also how other interventions that we are considering, be it a regular review process, be it a mandatory level of penalties, etc., would play out vis-a-vis their different ambition levels. And based on this, we will then design a policy package. Let me just show you what this means in practice, because we run this by, at least when the pollutants are in question, through a elaborate model that looks into the measures that need to be taken to achieve a certain air quality standard, in this case for PM2.5. We do something similar for other pollutants, but the prime pollutant we look at is PM2.5. You see here the 2020 map of levels of air pollution. You see very clearly those areas in yellow are areas that currently are above 10 micrograms. Those in orange are above 15, and those in red, and there are some of those, are above 20. This is the current standard. Under a baseline projection, we see that the number of yellow areas decreases, but there are still regions in Europe, in the European Union, that are in the segment above 10 to 15. You also see that quite a few additional regions meet the guideline levels of 5 or less, but also here we still see a huge aspect of the European area that stays in the segment of 5 to 10 micrograms. So this is our baseline. And then we assess what would happen if we set a standard at 10 micrograms and everyone takes the measures available to them to achieve 10 micrograms. You can see that this means that most of the EU would actually land in a setting where they are somewhere between, well, where they're certainly below 10 micrograms, and quite large areas in Europe would be even below 5. But you also would see that in the middle of northern Italy and in southern Italy, you still see areas where there is levels above 10. And that is because even with all the measures that need to be taken, some areas will struggle to achieve a level below 10 micrograms. That discrepancy increases even further when we set a 5 microgram target. This would imply that each region takes every measure that it can to reduce air pollution within the portfolio of measures that the model includes. And I'm going to say here, this model does not include the aspects of economic changes or dietary changes. But when we look at the technical measures that are available to regions, you see that even with setting a 5 microgram target, there is a, let's say, justified skepticism whether all regions in Europe would be able to go to a level below 5 micrograms. So these reflections feed our impact assessments and then translate into assessments not only of the feasibility, but also of the health impact that is associated to the remaining exceedances, and also the costs, both of taking the action, but also the benefits rendered by taking the action. And those elements then combined bring our impact assessment to the policymakers' attention to then decide which level of ambition to strive for.
So Thomas, you have about 2 minutes left, sorry.
Oh, I won't need those. I have one slide left. I mean, I can make it work for 2 minutes, but I'll try to be quicker, which is the summary of the process, the policy process as a whole. We started with our fitness check at the end. So we published our fitness check at the end of 2019. We have since been planning our process. We have been awaiting the WHO guidelines. We have looked at the WHO guidelines. We have had an extensive public consultation process. We have in the last 6 months focused on the impact assessment, meaning the assessment of the different options and what they would mean. Based on this, in the second half of the year, so pretty much starting in 4 or 5 days, we will be looking towards the adoption of the legislative proposal before the end of the year, so that the co-legislators, as I mentioned before, would be able to reflect on this and come to a decision on the future of the Ambient Air Quality Directives. The little flags denote which countries hold the presidency in the European Union, and it's up to them to then organize the council discussions about the views of the different member states. I hope this gave you a little bit of an overview of how we plan this process in Europe at the moment. I'm not able to show you the final outcome yet because we're right in the middle of the elaboration and of the finalization of the impact assessment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have some time for any clarification questions that you might have. If you could come to the mic, please.
I'm not sure if there's something being
said. Does it work?
Yeah.
Okay. Henrichs for University of Copenhagen, Denmark, and I have a question for the presentation that Dr. Erika Sasser had. It was about, I just realized that primary standards for NO2, nitrogen dioxide, are not under review. So, so 2 questions. First, why is that? And second question is that how it would be decided that the standards need a revision or not? Thank you.
So if I may, actually, we will have a discussion session. I believe your question was for Erika, not for Thomas, right? Okay, so maybe we'll keep that for later. Thank you very much. Yeah, please.
Hi there. There's a question from our remote audience about a clarification about how the individual industrial facilities are controlled. Are they left to individual countries to decide, or is that an EU process?
So Thomas, did you catch that question?
Sure.
All right.
Thank you. Should I take this one immediately? Yes. So this is part of this, what I mentioned before, the three-pronged approach. So we've got you remember the triangle that I showed with the Ambient Air Quality Directive on the top, the National Emission Ceilings Directive to the left, and on the right, source legislation. And the first one of those was an acronym that we used extensively here, which is the IED Directive, the Industrial Emissions Directive. And the purpose of the Industrial Emissions Directives is to look at the emissions by individual industrial facilities. And there is an elaborate process behind this Industrial Emission Directive, which in short I'll summarize with the establishment of something called best available techniques, and then the requirements to meet those, to operate within the frame of these best available techniques that is then mandated by different industrial area. And of course, all of this is then first and foremost implemented by member states, and where it doesn't work, then the EU steps in and does enforcement action when needed. I hope this captured your question.
Okay, thank you. So if not, probably we'll come back during the discussion session. I think we're running out of time now, so we'll move on to the next speaker. I now have the pleasure of introducing our last speaker of the session, Dr. Christina Fuller from Georgia State University. She's an exposure scientist, epidemiologist, and engineer dedicated to research that investigates relevant questions concerning air pollution exposure and health impacts. Her research aligns related areas, including many facets that look at this interesting aspect of environmental health and environmental epidemiology. She's a current member of CASAC, and she was a co-editor of the recent book, Ambient Combustion, Ultrafine Particles and Health. And her talk is going to be on ensuring that standards protect marginalized populations from disproportionate air pollution exposures. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. Since I'm the last speaker, I just want to make sure that everyone is up and aware. So I'm going to be giving some of my personal insights around how the standards can protect marginalized populations from air pollution exposures. And I have 20 years of experience, beginning first in engineering and then nonprofit work, working with communities, providing technical assistance, and then moving on into environmental health and research. So all of that really informs my research and my input for today. So I would definitely like to acknowledge first all of the incredible work that the EPA puts in. I'm a very new member of the CASAC, just starting this past year, and all the work that they do, compiling all of the information and literature, doing the analyses and preparing documents for the CASAC to be able to look at and to analyze is really a phenomenal piece of work. So I thank the EPA for doing such an excellent job. And so here I just wanted to back up and show how air pollution has improved over time. These are just some pictures that I got off the internet of Los Angeles, of how it was looking in the early 80s compared to how it is looking more recently. And you can visibly see the improvements in air quality over time. And as many people will find this familiar, there's a great deal of pollution in the urban environment. That's where most of my research is based, and especially on traffic-related air pollutants. And several of these pollutants, we have National Ambient Air Quality Standards 4, which I highlighted here in bold. And I'm going to focus mostly on particulate matter today, given when we are working and have provided recommendations, at least the CASAC, for that recently. So in terms of the history of specifically the PM 2.5 standard, I just have these here that I got from the EPA website about how we started off looking at total suspended particles many years ago, and how that level was set then and how it has changed over time. and it has become more stringent over time in response to the evidence showing health effects at lower and lower levels. And most recently, the recommendation that CASAC provided to Administrator Regan listed down at the bottom. So at-risk populations are also very important in terms of who the standards are meant to protect. And at-risk population considers both susceptibility and vulnerability. The susceptibility can be innate or acquired, it can be genetic, or it can be smoking or other types of exposures. And then vulnerability as well. And those things include socioeconomic position and different levels of exposure to the actual pollutants. And currently, as for at-risk populations for the EPA, they change depending on the pollutant, but include the children, include elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions. So focusing on PM 2.5 is that there's a great deal of variation over space and time in PM 2.5, and this is going to differ compared to some other pollutants as well. It's more gradual than some such as nitrogen dioxide, as many of you know, but this is a map just showing how that looks spatially for Atlanta, which is where I'm based, and this is looking at downtown Atlanta. And you can see the range there on the bottom and identifying where there may be people that are exposed to higher concentrations. And we understand a lot about how the built environment and sources and meteorology can generate variation in air pollution exposures. However, we don't know as much about the upstream factors that have caused that over time. So when we're thinking about at-risk communities and vulnerability, there's a great deal of air pollution disparities. And historically, poor and minority communities have been located close to sources, increasing their vulnerability for exposures. And this comes from concentrations of industry in areas that are predominantly communities of color or that are low income or immigrant communities. It has come from state-sanctioned processes such as redlining, where specifically based on race, communities were given, Black communities were given a red designation, and white communities were given a green designation, and red meaning they were not able to have access to funding for infrastructure. And those, not surprisingly, written down in terms of their infrastructure and encourage there to be facilities to come in, thus increasing exposures. Also things like land pricing. If you're in a community that's low income and there's a industry that wants to come in, everyone's always wants to save as much money as possible, but that's going to go in locations that it would be easier to build your facility and to run your facility. So that has been also naturally draws in those to certain areas. And especially things like zoning, changing zoning for different communities and having residential communities right next to industrial corridors. And also this idea of urban renewal, which I'm going to go to the next slide now. And for those of you who know the name Robert Moses, he was definitely an advocate and an enabler for this type of urban renewal. So that means cleaning out a lot of undesirable populations and making way for things such as highways. And so just to let you know kind of how this really plays out and how this could be a way of increasing exposures is to look at a map of Atlanta. And this is again, downtown Atlanta, similar to what you were just seeing in the map around PM 2.5. So this is Atlanta in 1952. And then if you look at, they came out a little bit light, but the yellow boxes, the yellow circles you can see are communities. This is all residential, and also the one with the red box as well. So if you put up a map of Atlanta in 2013, this was the building of the I-20 expressway. Oops. Okay. The I-20 expressway, which goes east and west of the city. of Atlanta, and then the downtown connector, I-75 and 85, that goes north and south. So these combine 450,000 vehicles per day, a lot of truck traffic. And so you can see this whole community is totally gone. This one has been impacted a lot, not really residential, mostly commercial now. And down here, supporting here is the highway. And then now the residences that are still there now but the highway. So that could be increasing their pollution level. Again, this has happened in all major cities and smaller cities across the country. This is in Louisiana. And this is a nice boulevard here. And then when they put in the elevated highway, now you have these buildings here, which abut the freeway right then. So this has happened in many locations and increasing concentrations and exposures for these populations that are next door. Again, this is from Somerville, Massachusetts, very similar as well. So coming to this figure from EPA, and while it's very important to notice, and this is on the left side is, oops, I keep making that. On the left side is the average PM concentration. On the right-hand side is the average mortality rate. And what you can see is that when you're looking at instilling lower and lower standards for PM 2.5, you do see a narrowing of the disparities between Black and white, but they're still there. And when you look at the actual mortality, it's a lot more stark contrast there. So putting into place even stiffer standards in the current form is still leaving on the table disparities that would not go away. And now moving on to susceptibility. And so cardiovascular disease is the most prevalent disease, especially among those 65 and over. About 30% of the population has some kind of cardiovascular disease. And there's evidence that pre-existing conditions increase the risk for adverse effects of air pollutants, such as cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease. And Black and Native Americans have higher prevalence of heart disease, stroke, and asthma. And so this is potentially going to increase the impact that PM 2.5 is going to have on these populations. In addition, there's evidence from many studies, hopefully more will be coming out looking at these questions about psychosocial and socioeconomic stressors that may also lower the body's ability to withstand pollutant insults. However, it hasn't been clearly shown that there's an effect yet. So how can regulations better protect marginalized populations? And so this can be first, and these are just a few, understanding the vulnerabilities and susceptibilities of populations. This is what the EPA defines as at risk, and to reevaluate how this fits into this category. So for the PM 2.5, it was very impressive that the EPA was looking at these populations and looking at risk and incorporating that. So for that to be done also in the other assessments as well, I think is very key to understanding these susceptible and vulnerable at-risk populations. Reviewing research studies that focus on potentially high exposure locations and time periods. So looking at locations that are close to roadways, also looking at exposure such as winter heating as well. So really figuring out where these peak concentrations can be coming from and how they can be addressed with the standards. Evaluating whether at-risk populations are more highly exposed under current and proposed standards, and that's what the EPA has done for PM 2.5, so to have that also moving forward with other reviews. And to think about how things can be changed, because even, like I said before, looking at lowering the standard, there were still disparities. So can there be changes to the form of the standards or for the compliance monitoring, looking at some of those high-risk areas? How can we change the standards so that they can be more representative of those at-risk populations that EPA is really trying to serve and make sure that they are protected? So there's been many estimates of the burden of disease from ambient air pollution, and it has a broad health impact. And what's very important is to see here is that there's variation across the world, and then also variation within cities, which I was talking about first. And it's not just a US problem. In each of these communities in different nations, then there are going to be different at-risk communities. So it has to be localized as well. So one of my colleagues and friends here was just telling me that she had gone to Delhi recently. And it's just very important to understand that this is not just a US problem and how we're not always going to be moving forward. There's many countries that was highlighted by the very first talk that don't have the same standards, and that we want to make sure that they are not left behind either. So what's shown here is then on a clear day, looking at the India Gate in Delhi, and then this is from some years ago, and then looking more recently, and this is from the New York Times in 2018, and seeing what it can look like today. So really needing to have the strength of standards to be able to protect public health abroad and also in the United States. So just to summarize, the NAAQS standards have been instrumental in the reduction of air pollution concentrations in the United States. However, there are still disparities, and actions must be taken to reduce those disparities. And I talked about just a few, but there's many more to be discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fuller, for that wonderful talk. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers as well. So now we're moving to the discussion portion of the session, and we're going to invite all our speakers up onto the podium, and also to have our online speakers projected on the screen as well. We may. This portion is actually going to be co-moderated by myself and Greenbaum, and we'll have all the speakers here, and the floor is going to be open for questions. We have a hybrid format. There will be questions that will be coming online that Elisa is going to present to us as they come in, but we'll alternate between the in-person and the online questions. Maybe we can start with a question that was asked of Erika after the first talk. I don't know, Erika, whether you got that question.
I wrote it down.
Yes,
I have it. So I think the question was why, on the chart that I showed, there were a couple of standards that were not highlighted as being under review currently. And the question was for NO2 particularly, is what would trigger the start of a new review? And it is true that we have not initiated a new review. Those standards were last reviewed concluding in April of 2018, and we have not initiated the next review of those standards yet. It is on our planning horizon to do that fairly soon. And the truth is that while the Act requires us to review standards every 5 years, we do internally have to sometimes make decisions about what the priorities are. And often we wait to see what the accumulated literature is, how much new information is out there. And that drives, the initiation of a new review. So something like particulate matter, where the literature is constantly evolving, there's a pretty strong back-to-back signal for that. But other reviews, not quite as much.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Please tell us who you are.
Dr. Kari Nato from Stanford University in California.
I'm not sure
mic is
the
not
microphone's on.
Dr. Kari Nato from Stanford University in California. First of all, thank you so much for having this session. And I wanted to ask Dr. Fuller a question, which potentially also could go to the whole panel. The vulnerable communities are at high risk for air pollution, as you mentioned, and you mentioned sort of the predisposition of COPD and asthma. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are for better indicators for stress. Nadine Harris has the ACEs criteria for pediatricians. You know, where are we moving forward for adults? Can we have standardized criteria for which we can then envelop that into our exposure estimates? And then I wanted to ask the whole group, where do you think our priorities should be in terms of mixed effects modeling, where any one individual on the planet is going to be affected by air pollution, potentially heat stress, other factors that are going to be compounding anyone's individual health effects due to environmental exposures? Where do you think the best effort should be across the globe on that studying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's one that myself and colleagues have been talking about a lot. I think there's no clear answer to that right now. However, many of the studies that have looked at stress thus far, as a modifier or mediator, have just looked at one measure of stress. And I think it's important to be very systematic about taking different measures because they don't all measure the same, they don't have the same context. And so using more than one measure in different studies and with different populations to see if we can understand more of which are really most appropriate to which populations. So, yeah. And then hopefully we will be able to answer that question and then be able to have more in the literature, we can draw stronger conclusions about it, whatever the conclusions may say.
Thank you.
I think the same question was directed to the other speakers as well, right? So if there is anyone who would like to reflect.
Dorota, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. I don't also have an answer, but this is definitely something that requires a lot of attention from the perspective of researchers. And in my view, there is no one response globally because this situation is very much context dependent, and we probably need the whole panorama of these interactions that would at some stage also support decision makers, policy makers to take locally relevant action. And we heard about the traffic-related air pollution in the recent presentation, and we are still not having a way to assess the health impacts, for example, of air pollution and traffic-related noise, despite many research activities. So we really need to invest to start maybe from those most obvious, also from the perspective of action interventions, and then to expand the spectrum of these interactions, either among environmental factors or between environmental and social at different scales. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thomas, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to comment on both aspects that you just raised. The first one about the focus on vulnerable populations or sensitive populations. One thing I did not stress sufficiently, I think, in our framework is that we are requiring member states to measure two different things. One is the general exposure of population, but also to measure the regions or in the areas where the highest concentrations that people might be exposed to is to be expected. So that in itself builds in a mechanism that sensitive populations can have the assurance that if there is no exceedance measured in the highest levels, that the value they are exposed to is hopefully below that if the system works. And we can always then discuss if all the monitoring stations do that, and that's something I was alluding to. Just to mention this, and the other bit is that a quality plan in Europe is explicitly invited to look at the impacts on sensitive populations. But to come back on your question on the multi-effect modeling, and also I'm not going to give you an answer, I'm just going to throw in two considerations. The first one is the importance of being able to still keep the impact of different elements apart so that we can have bespoke policies that address those. And then when we come to looking at the modeling of different parameters in combination, a first step would be for me to be able to do so for multi-pollutants in air pollution, because we still get from policy sides, from the health assessment community, separate numbers for particulate matter and for nitrogen dioxide that cannot be added up. And there's an overlap, but the number of overlap can be anything between, apparently, as I understand this, 10 and 50% or even more than that. And normally there is a bit of a benchmark given at around 30% overlap. But of course, as soon as you go to policymakers that like this to be simplified and broken down to them, this raises more questions to them than it provides them answers with. So the first step would be for me to be able to find a way to model the combined impacts of different air pollutants, and then expand to a range of number elements that can be integrated. And there it's noise and adaptation that I think, or adaptation measures from climate change that I think are particularly interesting. But that would be for me a second step, clearly. Thanks.
Thank you.
That's helpful. I think first of all, I'm going to ask our AV folks if it's possible to get our online participants to be a little bit louder. It's a little hard. I don't know about others. It's a little hard to understand, but I believe you were saying that one of the issues is the mix. It's just understanding how you model the combined effects of the different pollutants, let alone adding onto it the other factors that the question is asked about. And I would agree those are important challenges. But this is the kind of question that we at HEI have periodically asked ourselves: Are there methods that could be developed to better address these? So it's a very good question for us to take that.
Okay, I think there's a line, so let us.
An online questioner who might want to go, like,
Are there any online questions that you can go? Okay,
There
maybe we can
some.
alternate. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an online question that actually ties in a little bit with the previous answer from Thomas Henrichs. The question is for Erika Sasser. Is it or will it be challenging to integrate scientific evidence of the effects of pollutant or other exposure mixtures into the National Ambient Air Quality Standards?
I'm sorry, multiple goes into the standards themselves. Well, yes, I think we have to separate out the scientific questions about the relationship between the pollutants and their impact collectively on health responses from the question of, then as a policy matter, what do we do with that information? I believe that if we had perfect information about mixtures and social variables and other effects that exacerbate responses, that would inform the policy choice we make about where to set the standard. So I think the legal regime could handle a multi-pollutant consideration. If you knew that the presence of two things combined resulted in a higher risk for a certain subgroup, you could take that into account. And we've never done that exactly, but you could do it.
Hi, Chad Bailey from US EPA Office of Transportation and Air Quality. And I'm hoping this is a question that is general enough that anybody can answer. I kind of know the EPA side of this, but might be useful to hear. One of the things that happens when countries industrialize and urbanize is that you get a lot of NOx in urban areas, highly concentrated, so that reactive pollutants like ozone show up not in the city center, but downwind. So you can also have this nonlinear phenomenon where NOx reductions can cause increased ozone in places where previously all the NOx was scrubbing out the ozone. So it's kind of the basic notion is that some parts of PM and ozone don't respond linearly to what we expect. I think if you add EJ into it, it adds a different angle, and I haven't really thought about that very much. But I guess my general question is, how have the standard setting processes thought about these kind of nonlinearities in atmospheric chemistry in how do they fit in? Do they fit in here, or is this just an implementation side decision that has to be accounted for? Nice and simple question, I know.
I think Thomas, yeah, great. Is the hand from before or you are trying to answer?
The hand was up before, but I don't think I can completely dodge this question either. So you're completely, you're fully aware of the problems that managing ozone concentration places, not just vis-a-vis NOx, but also vis-a-vis the other precursor pollutants in ozone concentrations, and the fact that here in particular, we have a delocalized setting often, that the areas that are affected by ozone pollution may not be the ones that contribute to the precursors, and that you have these delocalized effects. How we should be managing this is to have governance structures that bring together those that are responsible for the different pollutant pathways, possibly bring into this very clearly the time dimension, because we have different times when pollutant matters and when pollutant doesn't matter, forecasting abilities, etc., etc. How we in reality deal with this is that we, rather than setting strict limit values, we set target values that keep the word "if possible" to take into account the meteorological conditions. So I'm giving you the both sides of the things. Of the discussion, but of course the way we look at ozone will be something that needs to be looked at in our revision process in the Air Quality Directive in Europe, but it is not a straightforward approach. And besides strengthening the National Emission Ceilings Directive or the National Emission Reduction Commitment Directives, there are very few tools that actually can achieve this need for transboundary cooperation that is needed to bring these levels down. That's a bit of reflection, and it's not fully policy validated. So take it as a sort of input.
Thank you. Any other answers from the panel?
I don't know if Erika wants to talk about ozone as a challenge. No.
Well, yeah, of course, that's the first thing that came to mind, Chad, with your question. I think this is a really complicated and excellent question, because we tend to think about measuring these pollutants at the highest locations and trying to resolve that. But the nonlinearity of the problem definitely complicates, the entire regime. And I think it raises the question of, if you push one lever, are you sure what the response on the other side is going to be? And when you mix that with how specific populations are distributed, you end up with some really interesting dynamics. And I would just say that I don't think we have adequately grappled with those questions yet. If you have thoughts.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Leanne Shepard from the University of Washington. And I have a question, I guess, predominantly directed to Erika, but also probably to other people from EPA. I'm really interested in our list of criteria air pollutants. It's given as like, this is the list. But actually the Clean Air Act, Section 108A1 says, for the purpose of establishing the national ambient air quality standards, the administrator shall publish and from time to time revise a list which includes each air pollutant. And it goes on, it has 3 pieces. Emissions caused or contributed to air pollution, which may be reasonably anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. The presence of which in ambient air results from numerous or diverse mobile or stationary sources. I think that's what Erika was saying in terms of ubiquitous. And for which air quality criteria hadn't been issued prior to December 31st, 1970, but for which plans to issue criteria under this section. So my question is, should we be thinking about the list of criteria air pollutants?
I will leave the should question for others to answer, but I will note that the agency does periodically get petitioned to add pollutants to the criteria pollutant list. I know we've had petitions for benzene, we've had petitions for CO2 recently, and in each case, I think there is a decision that has to be made about whether the regime that would essentially kick in if we were to add a pollutant to the list is the appropriate way to handle that pollutant. And so like CO2 is a very interesting example, right? It's certainly ubiquitous. It certainly is contributed to by numerous and diverse sources. But what would it mean to have a NAAQS for CO2 from an operational standpoint? Because the United States, we couldn't, the entire country would be presumably designated non-attainment. And then what would you do with that? So I think in each case, the decision has been made that there is a more effective way to go after the pollutant that was the subject of the petition. And I believe at the time lead was listed in the early 70s, it was a real debate about whether it needed to be under both the toxics program and the criteria program. And ultimately the courts resolved that by instructing EPA to add it to the list.
Thank you.
I might try and bring comments into this as well, just because in Europe, the main pollutants that are controlled under the Ambient Air Quality Directive are very similar, but there has been and there is an ambient limit values for certain air toxic, what we would consider air toxic. And I don't know if you are re-reviewing those at this time, or what the thinking is about those in the European context, because I believe there is a benzene, for example, ambient air quality, and a PAH, ambient air quality directive.
Yes, indeed. We have a total of 12 air pollutants, and those 12 include benzene. They include benzoapirin as a proxy for polyaromatic hydrocarbons. They also include arsenic, cadmium, nickel, and obviously also lead in the heavy metal sections of it, as well as carbon monoxide and the ones we talked about before. And the raison d'etre, I mean, they have been in the EU legislation since 2004. I mean, the full set has been concluded in 2004 with the 2008 directive bringing the PM 2.5 dimension into it. And they are largely based on the reviews and the reflections of the WHO air quality guidelines back in 1987 and then 2000, as which pollutants would warrant a policy response for ambient air quality standard setting. So that is how they came in there, and that's also why now under the revision we have explicitly been looking at the WHO good practice statements to see what can be said and done about ultrafine particles or black carbon and whatnot. So in our current revision, we are looking at all of those pollutants, and we have been also asking stakeholders at all of these pollutants about their reflections and expectations for future standards for all of these pollutants. Noting, however, that for the pollutants such as benzene and the heavy metals, the WHO has in the last decade or last 2 decades not updated its guidelines. And I'm sorry to bring you in, Dorota, but maybe you can say something about the choice of pollutants in the WHO setting, why some of them are featuring and the others not.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe if there is an online question, Elise, do you have any or? Okay.
Yes, we still have several questions online, but I think one that ties in with the European context is how to limit the consequences for the legislation and public health of the return to coal as an energy source in several countries in connection with the energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine.
I have this nagging feeling this is for me, but I've answered this in the chat already. There is a EU response to this called Repower EU, and that at least summarizes the position of the European Commission much better than I could do in a 20-second segment about how we are trying to facilitate the green transition even in this context. So it's in the link, it's called Repower EU, and it was published in May.
Yeah, I think this question is specifically for Europe. I guess, I don't know, Barbara, whether you have anything to add or none? Okay, all right. Yeah.
Okay, Francesco Forastiere from Italy. And as Europeans, we are a little bit biased towards NO2, especially because the diesel exposure. So my question is to Erika again. I know you responded to NO2, but you know, the last integrated assessment from EPA on NO2 was 2016. And in 2018, the annual standard was retained as 53 ppb, which corresponds to more than 100 microgram cubic meter, which is 10 times the new air quality standards, the WHO air quality guidelines. So at the present, the annual standard in the US is 10 times the WHO air quality standard. Don't you think it's time to revise the NO2?
I think that, I mean, you raised certainly an interesting question, and I think the next review will focus on, that question among others. I think we've made a lot of progress in reducing NO2 exposures in the US. We, right now, I believe, have no non-attainment areas for NO2. So a revision to that standard, especially to the degree you're suggesting, would certainly be quite a change for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I just might add that in the wake of those decisions, the earlier NO2 decisions, the first roadside monitoring networks were put in place in the United States in order to understand what the levels were of NO2. And in fact, the levels were, because the US does not have diesel cars running on its roads, the levels were actually quite low. I don't remember the actual numbers and how they relate to what the guidelines are, but they were much lower than the similar numbers that you would see by a European roadside. So it's not to say there's not an NO2 issue, but it's very different in the US than it is in Europe. And we had an entire session at this annual conference about 5 years ago on exactly this point of NO2 in Europe and the US. So maybe it's time for us to do another one.
Great. Thank you. So do we have an online question that you want to go to?
Yes, we have two final questions from online, and they're closely related questions. They're for the full panel, but specifically directed at Christina Fuller. Do you anticipate that regulations which successfully reduce exposure and health disparities for vulnerable subpopulations can be implemented at the national level, or will localized regulations be necessary to address local disparities? And related to that, another question relates to this about the form of standards that can be changed to be protective of susceptible and vulnerable populations.
I'm off. Now I'm on. So I think there needs to be a multifaceted approach. So, what's the difference between having, federal standards and then you have state-based standards is that some states are going to pick this up very easily and they're going to have standards that are very stringent and protective of public health. And then other states will not, even though they have the same issues. So I think federally having those standards there that applies to the whole country is very important. And then figuring out, and maybe that would be an implementation way of how they can best protect the at-risk communities. And I think it also takes a little bit of stepping back and figuring out that things may need to look a little bit different to protect at-risk communities as opposed to looking at means and averages. And I think those need to be explored because it's been such a persistent issue that we need to think about it a little bit differently and get some input on how to do that. But definitely the federal standards are very important.
I don't know if Eric were you going to add? Right. I was going to ask a follow-up to the two of, or to the two of you, a related follow-up. So you both put up a very interesting analysis which is in the policy assessment document, showing essentially what happens as different lower ambient air quality standards happen and what happens to the disparate impact, particularly between blacks and whites and mortality. I was struck by by the fact that even at the very lowest ambient air quality standard, the disparities were great. Did the analysis show that tightening the standard did reduce, did it reduce the level of mortality? I believe it did in the Black community. But did it reduce the disparities? My question is going to how good is ambient air quality standard setting at trying to address these issues? Because if to just get into attainment with the air quality standard doesn't really help you reduce the disparities. And I don't know whether the analysis showed you, even though it was still pretty bad, did it show any progress?
Yeah, excellent question. Let me see if I can answer this succinctly and bring together a couple of points here. What that diagram showed was, on the one hand, differences in exposure, which are significant but not as extreme. Those were on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, the really big gaps that you could see were in mortality rate. And of course, that's driven by factors beyond exposure, driven by underlying health conditions and other factors that will affect the rate at which people are dying, at a given level of exposure. And what we saw is that under successively tighter standards, when we roll back air quality to just meet, that's what we do, we just meet an alternative standard, what you saw was exposures are more equal, though still not totally equal, and the mortality response, the reduction in the mortality rate in Blacks is greater because they are, so sort of per increment of air pollution, more people are having adverse effects. So as air quality comes down, that gap narrows, which is good, but it still doesn't narrow. It still was quite sizable, even at the lowest standard level examined, which was 835, 8 annual, 35 daily. The other point I would make is that that analysis is sort of a hypothetical rollback of air quality. In reality, the actual measures that states take in specific areas to control pollution make a difference for how those exposure patterns actually manifest in real life. So we would actually expect that the real world implications of real control strategies based on what we know about the emissions inventory, the benefits might even be better than what that analysis shows.
And yes. Yes, so with the lower concentrations, the disparities were smaller, but they were still there. So we just need to understand also that when we're talking about race is just an indicator of many other things. And just the similar way that we are understanding how looking at one pollutant at a time can be problematic, and we need to look at the relationship between those. We also have to look between the relationships of different socioeconomic built environments and other types of factors as well. And also that it shows that just lowering levels is not going to solve the issue. Right, so we have to think more about some other ways.
Okay, so I think we are over time. So I think we have to stop it here. If you have any questions, I know already 2 people are on the lineup. If you could follow up with the speakers. And I don't know, do you have any closing remarks?
Well, first of all, the advantage of being in person and not online is that some of our speakers are here, and those of you who have questions can huddle around the podium and ask them afterwards, of which I hope you will. And I wanted to say that this is very helpful. I'm sorry you won't have that opportunity to ask those questions, but I want to thank Tomas and Dorota for joining us because it's really valuable. I've always found to compare and contrast and learn from the 2 systems and approaches. And thank the rest of the speakers and thank our chairs for doing it.